Welcome to Nice and Blunt. My name is Adam Riancho, and it's time for part 2 of my wide receiver rankings for 2024. In this video, we're going to talk about the top 20, but I've already given you my top 10. Here is a reminder of the top 10. I have a few different tiers, but at 9 and 10, I have Brandon Aiyuk, Nico Collins, who are in the same tier as the start of this video. You can put any of the next 4 receivers I'm going to mention at number 9. It's really just your preference. But at number 11, I have Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals, who may be the most hyped rookie wide receiver we've ever seen. At least in terms of ADP, we've never seen anyone going off the board at this type of price. He is wide receiver 9 on Underdog, pick 13 overall. I have been taking him at that price just to make sure I'm not underweight on Marvin, but I do think he might be a little bit overpriced just because he's a rookie and he might start off slow. It might take him a little bit of time to fully get acclimated to the NFL. But when you look at this offense, it's definitely a reason to be excited for Marvin Harrison. Kyler Murray's a really good quarterback, and there's no other competition for targets other than tight end Trey McBride. And if you look back to 2022, the last time Kyler Murray played with a true alpha wide receiver, if you remember, 2022 was the year that DeAndre Hopkins had that suspension for PEDs. And in the first 6 games, Marquise Brown had this offense pretty much all to himself. Then he got hurt, and for 5 games, DeAndre Hopkins had this offense pretty much all to himself as well. So it's an 11-game sample size we're looking at here, and boy, is it enticing. 11.1 targets per game, 8 receptions per game, 88 yards per game, and 5 total touchdowns, an average of 15.5 half PPR points per game for the Cardinals wide receiver 1 in 2022 without a number 2 receiver to compete with. This would have ranked as wide receiver 6 in points per game last year, and it speaks to why Harrison's ADP is so expensive. I'm a little bit hesitant to fully endorse this sample size as like a true projection. However, 11 targets per game for a rookie is pretty high to expect. So I'm projecting something more like 9 targets per game, and even that feels kind of high. So I don't see a massive ceiling, but it is within the range of outcomes, and that's why I think you can justify ranking Marvin Harrison as high as number 9 at receiver. But I have him here at number 11, just assuming that number is going to come down a little bit, and wide receiver 11 last season would have scored 14.1 points per game. So I still think there's a really good floor for Marvin Harrison. There will be some weeks where he probably puts up elite numbers, but I think if he starts off a little slow, you might be a little disappointed. Maybe Trey McBride is more of a factor than we expect, and that also eats into the target share in his rookie season. So I think to expect a rookie to finish as a top 10 wide receiver is going to be a little disappointing, but I have him here at number 11. It's not like I'm expecting anything much worse than that, and I kind of feel like I'm too low. His father is a Hall of Fame wide receiver after all, and has been grooming him for this moment. So I love Harrison. I think he's definitely a locked-in top 12 wide receiver at the worst. Next up, though, at number 12 is Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. I understand if you think this is a little too high. His ADP is wide receiver 16 off the board. However, I don't think it really accounts for his true upside. There was a 4-game stretch last season where he went nuclear. He averaged 7.3 targets per game, 5.5 receptions per game for 98 yards per game, and 12 rushing yards per game, a total 110 yards per game. And he also scored 8 total touchdowns from weeks 12 through 15. That was a 4-game sample size where he averaged 25.8 points per game. He was the wide receiver 1 during that month. So especially in best ball, I think he's an excellent pick. He has true elite upside, and there will be some games where he is just so dominant, you definitely want him on your roster. He will probably win you the week in fantasy. But if you remove his injury last season, the games that he missed, and look at the 12 full games where Brandon Aiyuk was healthy, we're getting a much more realistic projection. In these 12 games, averaged 14.3 points per game, 5.6 targets per game, 4 receptions per game, 2.4 rushing attempts per game, 73 total yards per game, 10 total touchdowns, and that is definitely a much more realistic projection. So while he does offer that truly elite upside, he could also give you like barely 10 points if he doesn't find the end zone. And I do think Aiyuk is going to take another step in this offense. I'm not a believer in the trade rumors for Aiyuk. I know there's a contract holdout that's looming for him, but ultimately I think Aiyuk will stay in the Niners offense, and they are going to take a shot at the Super Bowl one last time with the entire bevy of weapons, including Deebo, Aiyuk, George Kittle, and CMC. So I expect similar numbers to last year, but I do think the target share will come down just slightly for Deebo, and that's why I do have Aiyuk ranked higher in my overall rankings. I think I'd rather bet on the younger player who is going into his prime rather than the physical dual threat player that is a little bit more of a injury liability. So still a very safe pick in round 2. I love taking Deebo where I can get him. He goes at the end of the second round and I take him a lot. But at number 12, I still want him on my team where you can get him. I think you can reach on him, and it is justified sometimes to be unique at the 1-2 turn at pick 12 and 13. Sometimes I go with Deebo and Aiyuk there and make sure I get the Purdy stack later on. I kind of like that strategy. But here at number 12, I definitely think Deebo is worth his wide receiver 16 ADP, and I think he will be a good option for you in fantasy next season. At wide receiver 13, though, is a player we have to do a lot of projection for. His first 2 seasons in the NFL do not point to him putting up these type of numbers. But at number 13, I have Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, and we're really just hoping for the best with new quarterback Kirk Cousins, new coach Raheem Morris, and new offensive coordinator Zach Robinson. Morris and Robinson are coming from the Sean McVay Rams system, and there's definitely some reasons to be optimistic, but you can probably expect some growing pains when it comes to the chemistry being established between Cousins and Drake London. It's just not going to look as elite as it does with Cousins and Justin Jefferson. London is not that good of a player, but he was the first wide receiver drafted just 2 years ago, above guys like Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, and he definitely has the potential to put up a top 10 season. However, if you look at his numbers with Arthur Smith, there is nothing to convince you that that is going to happen. It's just the idea that Arthur Smith was tremendously holding him back as a play caller. In 2023, last season, London looked absolutely terrible in 4 games with Taylor Heineke. He averaged only 6.5 points per game. So let's throw those games out entirely and focus on the 12 games that London played with Desmond Ridder as his quarterback. He averaged just 9.2 points per game on 7.1 targets per game, 4.5 receptions per game for 60 yards per game, and scored only 2 touchdowns. These numbers are not much better than what he put up as a rookie when he scored 4 touchdowns. So touchdowns are probably going to go up. I would expect probably 7-8 touchdowns for London in this offense, and hopefully Kirk Cousins can get him the ball early and often on a weekly basis. But Cousins has been really efficient in Minnesota. He averaged 4,500 passing yards, 33 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions per 17 games in 6 years with the Vikings. Meanwhile, the Falcons last year only put up 3,775 passing yards, only 17 touchdowns, and 17 interceptions. So if London's numbers double from a touchdown perspective, we're definitely in better shape. But even then, wide receiver 10 kind of feels like an overly optimistic projection. Last year, wide receiver 10 on a per game basis was 14.2 points per game. That was tied between A.J. Brown and Deebo Samuel. And right now you have to draft London as wide receiver 10, pick 14 overall in order to get him on Underdog. So I'm not convinced that he's on par with A.J. Brown or Deebo Samuel. I think he is a little bit of a step down from those 2 receivers, and that's why I actually prefer taking Jonathan Taylor, who goes just behind him, pick 16 overall. So I mix him in here or there, but mostly if he falls to me after Taylor's off the board, and that's why he's just my wide receiver 13. But like I mentioned, I view all of these players in the same tier, so if you wanted to rank him as high as number 9 in the rankings, I wouldn't look at you crazy. I just think he's probably a more disappointing option rather than a smash pick. I think you're drafting him at his ceiling, and more likely than not, he will probably finish closer to wide receiver 15 or 16 rather than wide receiver 10. So at number 13, I'm kind of just hedging my bets, kind of splitting the difference, and maybe it's a wrong decision. Maybe he really pays off and puts up top 10 numbers, but I wouldn't be shocked if he is a big letdown and barely finishes a top 20 receiver this season and winds up as a big disappointment. So good luck if you draft him. I think you are going to need it, but he's probably worth the ADP in the second round, where all of these receivers are kind of all the same player at the end of the day. At number 14, though, I have Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints, who played 16 games in 2023. He averaged 11.6 points per game on 8.6 targets per game, 5.4 receptions per game, 70 yards per game, and 5 touchdowns. His average, though, went up to 12.8 points per game in the 7 games where Michael Thomas was not on the field. And the Saints have moved off of Michael Thomas finally, so that's probably a safer projection for Olave this year, but he only scored 3 touchdowns in those 7 games, and it's kind of hard to project more than 6-7 touchdowns for Olave in this Saints offense. I'm really not a believer in Derek Carr, and while there aren't that many other weapons in terms of target competition, you're really just looking at Rashid Shaheed and Alvin Kamara. Cedric Wilson is a new addition, and Juwan Johnson is currently dealing with foot surgery. I can talk myself into a possible breakout for Olave just as easily as I can talk myself into a letdown of a season. There is a new offensive coordinator, Clint Kubiak, who's coming from San Francisco. That's definitely an upgrade in terms of play calling, but Vegas actually has this offense projected for fewer total points in 2024 than last year. And if that happens, then it's really going to be brutal. The offensive line is one of the worst, if not the worst in the NFL, and I think this offense will sputter more often than not. I just don't see it for the Saints. I have them projected for 4 total wins this season. I am not a believer at all, and projecting more than 6 touchdowns just feels too optimistic for Olave, in my opinion. Maybe there's a scenario where he sees more than 10 targets per game, but he's only scored 9 total touchdowns in 31 career games, and that's what ultimately makes him just a floor play, in my opinion. I don't see the true ceiling being there for Olave. But just like London, I have him in the same tier as my wide receiver 9. You can rank him that high, and I don't think you're like insane, but I think he's much more closer to wide receiver 15 at the end of the day. I prefer guys like Marvin Harrison, Brandon Ayuk, and Nico Collins, as well as Deebo Samuel, some of which are drafted even later than Chris Olave. So that's why I pass on him that much. I'm not super invested in Olave. I prefer him in redraft because of his high floor, but in best ball, I think the touchdown upside is just lacking, and that's why I'm not that excited about Olave this year. At wide receiver 15, however, we enter a new tier, and there's arguably more upside for these players, as well as a little more bust potential when it comes to all of them. The quarterback situations are not as elite as well. But in this tier, age is also a factor, and you do kind of need to be a little bit lucky in the injury department, whether these guys stay healthy or one of their teammates go down with injury. I think there's no better example of this than Mike Evans, my wide receiver 15 this season. And last year in 2023, he did play all 17 games and did finish as the wide receiver 8 in points per game. He scored 14.3 points per game on 8 targets per game, 4.6 receptions per game, 74 yards per game. But what really put him over the top was 13 total touchdowns. That probably doesn't repeat, but I still think 10 is in the cards for Evans. He is age 31 in 2024. That's not a great sign, but he's definitely still the Bucs wide receiver 1. They gave him a contract extension this year. They signed him to a 2-year, $41 million contract to stay in Tampa Bay. Offensive coordinator Dave Canales, however, did leave. He's now the coach in Carolina, and overall that could impact the play calling and Baker Mayfield's success. So I'm a little bit worried about that. They replaced him with new offensive coordinator Liam Cohen, but the only year he was the offensive coordinator for the Rams was 2022, the year Stafford got hurt, and the year they barely won like 5-6 games. They were terrible in 2022. So that's not like the most encouraging sample size for this offensive coordinator. Otherwise, he has gone back and forth between the Rams and the University of Kentucky. And while there is some reason to be optimistic, there's also a reason to be worried because there's going to be more 11 personnel. And that means rookie Jalen McMillan, who was drafted out of Washington, will be on the field a lot and probably eat into the target share in this offense. I don't think it's going to be a significant impact on Evans, though. I think the bigger threat is still Chris Godwin, and Godwin only saw 6 fewer targets last season, but did catch 4 more receptions. He was more efficient in terms of catch percentage. Evans was just way more efficient in terms of yards per reception as well as touchdowns. Evans scored 13 touchdowns. Chris Godwin only caught 2 receiving touchdowns. So if you told me that that number evened out, where Evans scored 8, Chris Godwin scored 7, then Evans would take a massive hit. He would lose 2 points per game just based off of that stat alone. And if his other stats go down across the board, then we're barely looking at 12 fantasy points per game in 2024. But last year, 12.2 points per game was still a top 20 receiver, and that is where you are drafting Mike Evans. He is currently wide receiver 17 off the board, pick 23 overall, and you are basically drafting him at his floor, in my opinion. Last year, he was wide receiver 8, so we're not really accounting for his true upside. And if that does hit again, if he puts up another 10 plus touchdowns, he will absolutely smash this ADP. But with all of these factors considered, I think it might be a little more of a wise decision to target Chris Godwin in this offense. If you're going to target just one of the Bucs receivers, Godwin is going off the board as wide receiver 36 and does look like a much safer option who probably sees just as many targets yet again as Mike Evans. I say this despite the fact that I've ranked him as wide receiver 15, which is higher than his ADP by 2 overall spots. So I still draft him quite a bit. I still think he's a really good option, and he is definitely still Baker Mayfield's favorite target. That's why I think the touchdowns will repeat at least 10 once again for Evans this year. So if he ever falls to you in the 3rd round, take him wherever you can get him. But moving on to my wide receiver 16, I have DK Metcalf, who has been a very consistent receiver ever since his rookie season in 2019. Here, I have his average stats on the left per season, and on the right, I have his total numbers in 2023. On average, he puts up 124 targets. Last year, it was 119. He averages 74 catches per season. Last year, it was 66. He averages 1,066 yards per season. Last year, it was 1,114. And an average 8.6 touchdowns per season was on par. Last year, he put up 8 touchdowns in 16 games. So he averaged 12 points per game in half PPR, and on the screen here you can see his per game stats in the 14 games he played with Geno Smith, where he averaged 12.1 points per game. So I don't see those numbers going down at all. I think that's his floor every single season, and it's not like injuries are a concern. He's been very durable. He's only missed 3 games in his 5-year career. He's also one of the higher paid wide receivers in the NFL, averaging about $24 million per season. And based on the target share last year, he was clearly the wide receiver 1 in this offense. It's possible that JSN takes a leap in year 2, but Tyler Lockett, getting older, probably takes another step back. And that's why I still prefer Metcalf as a top 20 receiver. There's also a very optimistic outlook this season for Metcalf because they have a new offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, formerly of the Washington Huskies, who put up top 5 numbers across the board in passing in all of college football. So I definitely see a pass-first offense for the Seahawks this year, but Geno Smith is ultimately my big red flag overall in this offense. He's not the best quarterback, but he is serviceable. He's definitely league average at worst, and I think that is what keeps me somewhat enticed in DK. If you told me his targets went up and he repeated the volume from 2022, he would be seeing 140 targets next season along with 90 receptions. And if his efficiency stays high, you can definitely project 1,200 plus yards for Metcalf this season. If he also was able to jump up to 10 touchdowns this season, then you can project 13.4 points per game for DK in 17 games next season. And last year, that would have ranked as the wide receiver 13 on a per game basis. So if that happens, you are definitely getting a great value with DK Metcalf. His ADP is wide receiver 20 on Underdog, pick 25 overall. And I think he is one of the safest picks at receiver at ADP, going at the top of the 3rd round. So you're definitely drafting him at his floor, and there's a potential that he finishes as not just a top 15 player, but top 10 receiver, and that is why I like him a lot. There's going to be more targets available this season. He's guaranteed for 8 touchdowns every single year, and he's almost never going to go down with injury. He is a bust-proof pick where you get him. So that's why I have him near the top of this tier. I like him a lot. However, you can argue for him closer to wide receiver 20. I wouldn't fault you at all if you thought I was a couple spots too high on DK Metcalf. But I like him a lot, and as the true wide receiver 1 alpha in this offense, I think he will smash at his current ADP. Next up, though, I have Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles as my wide receiver 17. He's the number 2 for Philadelphia, and he also just got paid this offseason. He signed a 3-year, $75 million extension, which keeps him in Philly through 2029. At age 26, he's entering the prime of his career, and in 2023, he had a pretty up and down fantasy season. Across 16 games, he averaged 11.8 points per game, but if you had him on your team, you knew that that was not a good example of what he actually did for fantasy. In 6 games, when A.J. Brown was super dominant, weeks 3 through 8, Devontae Smith actually disappeared. He averaged only 8.4 points per game, but in 3 games when Dallas Goedert had a broken arm, weeks 11 through 13, Smith was fantastic. In those 3 games, he scored 2 touchdowns, caught 7.3 receptions per game for 100 yards per game, and averaged 17.7 points per game. He was a top 10 receiver in that sample size. But if you remove the 6 games where A.J. Brown went nuclear, as well as those 3 games without Dallas Goedert, and look at the other 7 games, I think that's a much more reasonable projection for Devontae Smith moving forward in 2024. Devontae averaged 12.2 points per game. He scored 4 touchdowns, caught 4.4 receptions per game for an average 66 yards per game, and 12.2 fantasy points per game, would have ranked as a top 19 receiver last season on a per game basis. So I'm right in line with that projection here at number 17. I think it is a good price point for him. He's being drafted as wide receiver 18 off the board, pick 25 overall. I do think Metcalf is a little bit safer, but I do think Devontae has higher upside if somehow Dallas Goedert goes down again with injury, or if A.J. Brown gets hurt, you're definitely getting a top 10 wide receiver in that scenario. So that's why I think Devontae Smith is a very safe pick. I think he has a top 20 floor and definitely contingent league winning upside if anything were to happen on this depth chart. So draft him where you can. I take him a lot at this price. But one spot behind him at wide receiver 18, I have Jalen Waddle, who I view almost identically in the same lens as Devontae Smith. He's also an excellent wide receiver 2 in a high scoring offense. The wide receiver 1 alpha above him is a little bit older and does cap his upside, but if he were to go down, offers Waddle top 10 upside as well. And just like Devontae Smith, he just got paid this offseason. He got a 3-year, $84.75 million extension, keeping him with the Dolphins through 2029. And at age 26 as well, he is also entering the prime of his career. Last year, though, on a per game basis, Waddle was not as good for fantasy as Devontae. He only averaged 11.6 points per game, but he was injured throughout the season. He not only missed 3 full games, he also played on 61 or fewer percent of snaps in 4 other games. So in those 4 games, his fantasy numbers were really brutal. He fell to an average 7.4 points per game, and that was definitely not impressive. Similar to Devontae Smith, there was a really rough stretch of the season for Jalen Waddle. But there were also 2 games where Tyreek Hill got injured, and in that sample size, Waddle was elite. He averaged 17.6 points per game. He saw 8.5 targets per game, caught 7 receptions per game for 110 yards per game, and scored 1 touchdown. In those 2 games, he really showcased his top 5 upside that would be realized if Tyreek Hill were to get injured again this season. Tyreek Hill is going to be 30 years old in 2024, so it's not impossible that happens, but assuming both players stay healthy, let's look at the 8-game sample size in 2023 where that was the case in order to better project Waddle in 2024. In these 8 games, Waddle averaged, just like Devontae Smith, 12.2 points per game, saw 7.9 targets per game, caught 5.4 receptions per game for 73 yards per game, and scored 3 touchdowns, just like Devontae, 12.2 points per game, would have been wide receiver 19 on a per game basis. So his ADP of wide receiver 15 on Underdog is justified, but it is factoring in a little bit more of that contingent top 5 upside, and that's why I do prefer drafting Devontae Smith just a little bit going later. But I still think you can absolutely justify the number 19 overall ADP for Jalen Waddle. If Tyreek does go down, you have a league winner on your hands. But if we're nitpicking, I'm looking for tiebreakers between the two, and I do think Jalen Hurts is a better quarterback than Tua, definitely more likely to stay healthy. And in Week 17, the fantasy championship, Waddle goes on the road at Cleveland, where weather might be a factor, whereas Devontae Smith plays at home against Dallas, a likely shootout. So it's really the same when it comes to these 2 players. I think if you want to put Waddle above Devontae, you absolutely can. But if you separate these 2 guys, have them more than 1 pick apart from each other, I think you're making a mistake. They are exactly the same value in fantasy this year, and my preference is Devontae Smith by just 1 spot. But these last 2 players are some older veterans that also offer top 10 upside themselves. Perfect example here is Cooper Kupp, my wide receiver 19 of the LA Rams. And last year we were drafting him with a top 5 pick. It was not long ago where he was averaging 20 plus points per game. That could happen again. After all, he does still play for Sean McVay. Matthew Stafford is still his quarterback. And with no Aaron Donald on defense, they might have to lean more heavily on the passing game. There might be a few more shootouts for the Rams this season. But there are some injury concerns. 2 years ago, he missed half the season, and last year he missed the first 4 games on IR with an injured hamstring that led to Puka Nacua overtaking him on the depth chart in this offense. So I definitely prefer Puka. I'm not going to argue for Kupp over Puka at all, but Kupp still has really high upside. We saw that when he got back healthy on the field in weeks 5 and 6. He was red hot. He averaged 20.1 points per game and was putting up 133 yards per game in his first 2 games back last season. But he quickly fell off a cliff starting in week 7. For a 5-game stretch, he averaged only 2.4 receptions per game and only 25 yards per game, did not score a single touchdown, and was absolutely terrible in that stretch. It is worth noting, though, that Matthew Stafford missed 2 of those games with injury, and Kupp was on the injury report with an ankle sprain of his own. But it's not an excuse. He was an absolute roster liability with an average of only 3.7 points per game in those 5 games. But in the final 5 games of the season, he got back on track. He averaged 14.9 points per game with 4 total touchdowns. He went over 100 yards twice. So there was some massive upside. There were some games where he was a top 5 receiver. There were also some games where he wasn't even top 60 at the position. So very up and down, boom bust, roller coaster type of season for him. And if you drafted him like I did in the subscriber league, he probably cost you a playoff spot because you could never bench him. And when you finally did, he started to play well. So I don't feel great about Cooper Kupp, honestly. There are some definite red flags. He could probably miss another 5 games this season, and you wouldn't be shocked at all. He did turn 31 years old in 2024, and if Matthew Stafford goes down as well, he's definitely going to fall off a cliff once more. But he's also a potential top 10 receiver. If you told me that he played a full season and Stafford was also a guy that stayed healthy, I wouldn't be shocked at all if Cooper Kupp was the wide receiver 12 on the year. And if Puka Nacua somehow goes down with injury himself, then we're looking at a top 5 receiver once again. So there's league-winning upside for Cooper Kupp, but the red flags do speak for themselves. But I do feel like his injury risk is baked in to this ADP. On Underdog, he's going off the board as wide receiver 21, pick 28 overall, and I do think he's a value in the middle of the 3rd round. I think he's one of the last receivers I really want to draft, and if he does stay healthy, you are definitely getting a great value on your team. So that's why I'm willing to take a shot on him. I think he's absolutely a top 20 receiver. At number 19 in my rankings, I do endorse Cooper Kupp. I think he has one more year of high production left in him, and we've also seen many times over the Sean McVay offense offer multiple top 20 receivers for fantasy, whether it's Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, Odell Beckham Jr., Brandon Cooks, Puka Nacua, you're getting a really good option. And I want a piece of this Rams offense where I can get him. Sometimes, though, I prefer to grab Kyren Williams, given he's much younger and probably is going to miss fewer games next season. But the last player in this video, the last player in this team is my wide receiver 20, Davante Adams, who I am definitely low on compared to consensus. Adams' ADP on Underdog is wide receiver 14 off the board, pick 19 overall. So if anything, he qualifies as my bust candidate of the round 2 receivers, and he is about 6 months older than Cooper Kupp himself. He turns 32 years old in December, and despite his age, he has been very durable. He only missed 14 total games in his 10-year career, and last year he played all 17 games despite being injured with a shoulder injury earlier in the season. So if you are watching Receiver on Netflix, you know all about it. He had a very difficult year in 2023, not just physically, but also mentally, with a terrible coaching situation with Josh McDaniels and a brutal quarterback situation with Jimmy Garoppolo and Aiden O'Connell. But it didn't really matter who was his quarterback last season. Davante Adams put up almost identical numbers with both Jimmy G and AOC at QB. He averaged 12.6 points per game last season across all 17 games. He was getting 10.3 targets per game, 6.1 receptions per game for 67 yards per game. He also scored 8 touchdowns and was decent, but nothing special. There were some games when he was truly elite, but also some games where he disappeared, and he was also a bit boom bust for the sake of fantasy. Some weeks he was a liability in your roster, and it was better to have Jacoby Myers instead. This year he gets a slight quarterback upgrade with Gardner Minshew, but I'm not convinced that that's actually the case. Minshew looked decent last season for the Colts, but I think that was mainly thanks to Shane Steichen, an elite play caller at head coach in Indianapolis. Here in Las Vegas, I think there's some big issues in this offense. The fact that they move off of Josh Jacobs at running back probably means they're going to score fewer points overall, and I think there might be a little more attention on Adams, as well as possibly fewer targets with the addition of rookie tight end Brock Bowers, the 13th overall pick in this year's draft. It's probably not going to matter that much for Adams. It's probably more so going to limit Jacoby's volume, if anything, but still I have a hard time predicting a ton of touchdowns in this offense, and that's why I'm not that excited about Davante Adams. You have to draft him at his ceiling. I don't think he's going to be much better than wide receiver 15 next year, and at number 14, there is no room for error. Unlike some of the players going after him with contingent upside, if one of his teammates gets hurt, Adams is only going to get worse with more defensive attention, whereas guys like Waddle, Devontae Smith, Cooper Kupp have top 5 potential if other teammates of theirs get hurt in Tyreek Hill, Puka Nacua, or A.J. Brown. So I don't see a lot of optimism for Davante Adams. I think there's a lot of red flags and very few green lights. That's why I'm really disappointed anytime I do take him, and that's why I'm fading him heavily. I think he's more deserving of a 3rd round draft pick, not a middle of the pack 2nd rounder, and that's why I've taken very little of Adams. I am very underweight on the 31-year-old receiver this season. Maybe he gets traded. There are some rumors that the Jets could offer a big haul for him, but even in that scenario, like, he has to compete with Garrett Wilson all of a sudden, and you're just hoping Rodgers stays healthy and puts up similar numbers to what we saw in Green Bay. So I don't see any scenario where Adams finishes as a top 10 receiver, and that's why at number 20 in my rankings, I am going to pass if I can. But at the end of the day, if you told me you thought I was too low, I understand. This tier is from wide receiver 15 through 20, and I all view them kind of identically at the end of the equation. So it is what it is, but these are my top 20 receivers. A reminder of the tier breakdown, starting with Brandon Ayuk in tier 4. At number 9, I have Nico Collins right behind him, followed by Marvin Harrison Jr., Deebo Samuel, Drake London, and Chris Olave. But in tier 5, I have Mike Evans, DK Metcalf, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, Cooper Kupp, and Devontae Adams. So really good players. I think they're very valuable in fantasy this year, and especially on Underdog, you should probably still be taking them in the second round. But if I can get any of them in the third round, I am ecstatic, and I'm definitely hitting that button whenever I can. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button for me and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. But if you disagree or agree, let me know in the comment section down below. I'm happy to hear your opinion and take some criticism. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of it. But that's going to be it for me in this video. My name is Adam Riancho. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.